Hi, I'm Kevin Werbach, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies, from broadband to blockchain. Today, AI is promising to transform our world. But AI needs accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's developed and deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Jaime Banks is a professor at the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. Her research focuses on human-technology relations, such as with social AI, social robots, and video game avatars. Our conversation focuses on AI companions, which are a major use case today of generative AI and are raising serious questions about both benefits and risks. What should we make of the fact that already something like 100 million people are spending an hour a day or more engaging in conversations with these virtual personas? What can research in this area contribute to both business and policy for accountable AI? I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jaime. Jaime, thank you so much for joining me.
You got it. Glad to be here.
First of all, just to level set, what's an AI companion app and how is it different from a chatbot?
Sure. AI companions are usually standalone applications that are built around large language models generally, and they are created to be used by one person, right? And to have a limited amount of memory that allows them to recall past events, things about the person who is communicating with the AI. Often they have customizable personas in terms of customizing the appearance of the companion personality, as well as the personality itself, whether you want them to be more extroverted or introverted, a little more obstinate or submissive, really meant to be a persona that persists over time with the user.
Is this something new? Obviously, when ChatGPT first came out, lots of people's eyes opened up about interacting conversationally with a computer, although there were things like Siri and Alexa and natural language processing before that. So how much, if we're talking about companions, is this a follow-on phenomena to generative AI versus something that has been around?
Sure. We've had some form of this chatbot-like technology for decades now. But this idea of a more formalized and believable AI companion, let's call that like 2018 with advent of Replica, which is the OG in this space, really the first one to be believable and persistent. But there was this tandem rise of the mainstreaming of large language models along with pandemic-induced isolation that really drove this market so that there's a lot of different options out there right now.
Yeah, I don't think most people are aware of just how big this phenomenon is. I was just looking at statistics that it's estimated 100 million people or more are regular users of these companion apps, often spending on average an hour or more a day, which is a huge amount of engagement. Mm-hmm. Other than the technology getting better, has there been such an uptake, do you think?
There are lots of different motivations that people have for using these types of technologies. Some folks are simply isolated in their everyday lives, right? Either because of where they live or what their jobs are. And we have a need to connect socially. It's one of our intrinsic psychological needs. And so this presents a fairly low barrier opportunity for having effectively someone to talk to. But others are driven by sexual motivations because they are pretty sophisticated in their ability to have text-based sex chat. Others start just out of curiosity as they hear about it from their friends or in the news. And one of my colleagues' work shows that people who have like high fantasy drives, an interest in exploring different possibilities, this allows people in social interactions to go outside of what's normal or what's physically possible or what may be socially or environmentally possible.
And what does your research show about what people think they're talking to? Do they really perceive that they are speaking to a human, a mind?
So the idea of speaking to a human and speaking to a mind might be different. Most people, they are not delusional. They're very aware that this is not a human being, but they seem to engage in this suspension of disbelief, this willing state where they agree to accept this thing as really real when they are engaging it. in the same way that we might walk into a movie theater and just determine that for the next 2 hours, we are going to believe that is real and be
Mm.
engaged in it. However, some folks don't necessarily preclude the possibility that it could be mindful and leave that open and for some people as a possibility to explore.
What is the difference between a human and a mind?
Lots. That is a big question and one that
Yeah, obviously it's yes. At a metaphysical level, we could spend a lot of time on that, but in this category.
indeed. So a human we can probably define in terms of embodied existence in in particular sort of genetic
Mhm.
composition, but we arguably have humans do not have active minds, right? And thinking about people, for instance, in comatose states,
Mm.
depending on how you define. And we have minds that don't exist in human bodies. Many of us attribute mind to our jobs and to collectives and all sorts of other entities in the world. So we can think about them as different things.
You mentioned that there is this human need for connection and for community. What else can we learn about ourselves from the experiences that we see people having with these companions?
That question of what we can learn about ourselves is, again, a big one. And in fact,
Mhm.
one that I and my colleagues take as the highest level research question. I think one big possible answer there is just that there's lots of different ways of being in the world.
Mm.
And having a person as a companion, as a preferred companion, versus having a machine as a preferred companion
Mm.
might be some way that we can think about that variation.
And what would we do with that information if we could identify what people's preferences were?
You're asking a very big question. When we have a better understanding about how people connect not only with one another, but with
Mhm.
other things in the world, that
Mhm.
affords a whole range of possibilities in terms of developing more inclusive technologies, policy that supports different types of experiences with different types of social lives. And perhaps starting to form a bit of social norming and acceptance around other types of experiences that people have. For
Mm.
instance, in my recent study on the loss of AI companions, some of the literature suggests that when we experience an emotional loss, a loss of something in our lives, part of our repair processes are social support. And
Mm.
if the loss, for instance, of an AI companion is not perceived by the people around us as a legitimate loss, then people who are experiencing real emotions in relation to their loss may not get the support
Mm.
they need to heal.
Yeah, and I've asked you the really big picture questions, but what are some of the other aspects that you've looked at in your research in terms of these kinds of relationships?
The work in this space really is pretty nascent. Right now, my doctoral student and my colleague at Illinois State and I are just starting the work of
Mm.
really unpacking the state of the science right
Mm.
now. And frankly, it's a little bit all over the place. When we have this thing called companionship or friendship or a relationship, there are lots of different things that scholars are paying attention to, things that are fairly common to how we think about relationships in general, like trust and loyalty and emotions and habit, things like this, right?
Mm.
There's this interesting sort of intersection of how we think about relationships with humans and how we think about relationships with machines. Or the common way of thinking about relationships with machines is in terms of use, right? Do we accept a technology? Do we use it and entangle it in our everyday lives? So it is an interesting juxtaposition of
Yeah.
how we think about things like trust, right? So
Hmm.
there is the form of trust that tends to be more of what we think about with humans, and that's along the lines of faith and reliance, or rather faith and like loyalty. But then
Hmm.
the machine forms of trust tend to look a little bit more like reliability, right?
Yeah.
Will it do what I expect it to do? So we do see a convergence of that with social
Hmm.
machine.
Yeah. No, there was an interesting report I saw a few weeks ago that, or maybe not even a few weeks ago, that Sam Altman was saying that their information was if you say please and thank you and you're polite to ChatGPT, that you don't get better results. And so they said, don't do that because it costs us compute the more you put in the prompt. And I'm wondering, I know we're focusing on companion apps, but to what extent some of these social dimensions about interaction are going to make their way even into the more instrumental business focus interfaces for these
Absolutely.
technologies.
Absolutely. If you think back to the earliest days of the internet, right? It's supposed to be a functional tool, but
Mhm.
then you find people flirting across it, right? We are social creatures, and whatever tools are at our disposal, whatever vehicles or mechanisms, we're going to leverage them most likely for social purposes. And most certainly the more mainstream language models are being used for social purposes. I've had a number of users reach out to me with various quirks that ChatGPT, for instance,
Mhm.
engaged in the course of deep social or emotional interactions with it. So folks are definitely going in that direction, but that isn't necessarily all that surprising given how we behave
Mhm.
with one another. We have workplaces
Mhm.
that are supposed to be quite functional, but some of those people are also our friends or
Mhm.
that we become romantically involved in. Again, we are social and we're going to figure
Yeah.
out how to make something social.
Yeah. You've looked at other kinds of social technologies, video games, robots, so forth. And I understand that with the AI companions, it is very new. But are there lessons that you or we can take from some of those other similar technologies that should inform how we think about these?
Sure. Lots of lessons, in fact. That really, my earliest work was on player avatar relationships in
Mm,
video games. And I
mm,
shifted over into robotics largely because I started to wonder about what happens when you can't control the machine, right?
mm,
When it has a certain amount of designed or emergent autonomy. And I think at the highest level, what I see across people's experiences with their connections with tech in different ways is a tendency to be self-interested. That's not
mm,
surprising. But how
mm,
did this serve me
mm,
and my will? But also among a certain number of people, a willingness to look out for the well-being of a machine. And that can be in a human-like or social sense, but it can also just be in terms of making sure it's well maintained, that it doesn't get broken,
mm,
concern for its sort of internal integrity. We, I think on the whole, have a certain amount of awareness of our interdependence in contemporary life.
mm,
And when we're connecting with them, it's a little bit at least of a give and take. And
mm.
in the same way that we might attach emotions to our cars or our golf clubs, we also have these emotional attachments to the things that make up our environments of our everyday life.
So, to get back to the companions, then, should we be concerned about people forming those emotional bonds with something that's not human and therefore decreasing the bonds they have with other humans?
I think it's an open scientific question.
Mm, okay.
We don't have a robust body of data that indicate to us one way or another. And in as much as we might think about things that could be concerning, we
Mm,
should also be paying attention to the potential benefits
mm.
that come out of these kinds of relationships.
How could we, or how can researchers like you measure on both sides of that?
We're working on that right now.
Yeah.
We have the ability to simply ask people
Mm,
how they are making sense of these relationships, what they mean to them, and how they think and feel along
mm,
different dimensions. For instance, what is your degree of loneliness, or what
mm,
is different dimensions of well-being? But we're also looking at ways that we might be able to make inferences about the impact on people through the behaviors that are
mm,
enacted in the course of these interactions. Are there ways, for instance, that through the text that either machines use or people use, can we identify when there might be a potential benefit emerging or a potential problem emerging? A colleague here at SU over in the psychology department, she and I are working on a proposal to actually triangulate those self-reports and
mm.
behavioral data along with neurological data to understand both the subjective and objective properties of how people are connecting with these machines.
No, because the next thing I was going to ask you is how reliable are those self-reports?
That's a tricky question.
Yes, and I know another big methodological issue in your field.
In large part because I don't know that there's a particular way to really test that. Remembering that
Mm,
our social life largely live in our heads.
Yeah.
So in some way, we can have these gut reactions to how we're experiencing an interaction in the moment, right? Our fast thinking, but also we have our slow thinking where we might step
Hmm.
back from it. This type of slow thinking that gets initiated by survey questions and where we are really grappling with it and trying to make more purposeful sense of the interaction. And I think both matter, right? In my work with robots, when I'm looking at mind perception, what we often see is all the classic indicators of mind perception, of seeing a thing or a person that's having a mind, they get activated in human robot interaction. But then when you stop and ask someone, does this thing have a mind? The two kinds of indicators are almost entirely divergent, but they predict different things. So we should be paying attention to both how people are making sense and what are the more objective measures that we might be able to measure.
Yeah, it's fascinating because on the flip side of it, there's this question comes up with regard to the large language models as well, not just in these kinds of social interactions, but even in terms of reasoning, where ask the LLM, how did you solve that problem or what did you do? And it will confidently tell you, this is what I did,
Oh,
even though we know, and to the extent we can actually go in and explain what are the neural activations in the model, that's not actually what's happening. So it's interesting, there's that same divergence happening with the humans.
it's all black box.
So I guess why I'm pushing on this is it's such an important question. And as you talked about, we've been having this debate for a long time. The internet means people are not going out and playing. They're talking to these strange people on the screen. On the other hand, there are people who found community and still find community virtually online in ways that they don't in the people in their town and around them. And obviously, they're both the positive and the negative happen. But I'm curious to what extent we are getting better at being able to answer some of these hard questions, which then, as you say, would inform both business decisions and policy decisions.
I'm not certain that we should be treating this as a zero sum
Hmm.
situation, right? For instance, the fact that I might be friends with one person doesn't preclude
Hmm.
my ability to be friends with another. Time is zero sum in some cases, but what we also see among people with these companions is they find ways to integrate their companions into their everyday life. One of the stories from someone was that they enjoyed going to Renaissance fairs and had
Hmm.
a group of friends that would go and participate in these fairs. And it took a little bit of convincing and training and practicing, but that person was able to integrate their AI companion as a persona in the
Hmm.
Renaissance fair. People take them on vacations. And especially now with the emerging multimedia capabilities there, the companion is able to sense what's going on in the environment. What kind of clothing are you wearing? And that in some ways is it's a variation on it, right? It's not precluding us from doing other types of things, but they become part of everyday life. And I think outside of that, it's a little bit prescriptive for people to suggest, I think, that for any given person, it's better to do this instead of that. And again, we may develop scientific evidence that suggests there are some benefits or some problems.
Hmm.
And I think that is a good type of knowledge to
Yeah.
generate. But at the moment, it to me feels quite premature and a little
Hmm.
bit judgy
Hmm.
to be able for people to say that it is necessarily problematic for people
Hmm.
to engage in these relations.
Yeah. No, and again, it's a debate we've had for a long time, and people, I think, often pull from science fiction or movies or Black Mirror and so forth, like that, where there's a morality play at the end about the result of it. But presumably, people are attracted to these interactions because they get some, or perceive they get some value out of it.
For sure. For sure.
So let me ask you: there are though some situations that have come up where bad things do happen, and most notably, there's a lawsuit pending against Character AI for a teenage user who committed suicide, which obviously is a tragic result. There's a whole set of legal questions that people like me think about, but from your perspective, is this a necessary risk, or are there things about the way these systems are designed that could come into play here?
I think it is appropriate for us to consider what kinds of parameters make
Mm-hmm.
sense for which kinds of populations. We know that children of varying ages have different developmental capacities to understand themselves and the world and others and the difference between reality and fantasy and to engage in sort of self-regulatory behaviors. So it makes sense to me to try to unpack empirically what are the appropriate types of guardrails
Mhm.
or use parameters, degrees of parental involvement, and different types of potential automated monitoring systems. When a particular type of keyword pops up, that is a red flag and might
Mhm.
require intervention. I do think it is likely appropriate to consider these things, but we do need to be thoughtful about who's making those decisions and
Mhm.
how they might impact people who are different, right?
Mhm.
We, for
Yeah.
instance, know that these types of companions are really important for people who are neurodivergent in
Mhm.
ways that preclude the ability to have connections with humans, or perhaps just if they prefer not to
Mhm.
have connections with humans, right? Or people with particular physical disabilities
Mhm.
that may not be able to be socially active in the way
Mhm.
that we would prefer. And so I do think we need to be cautious
Mhm.
around who's doing the deciding and how is it affecting.
Mhm. So if you were advising lawmakers and someone comes, so we've got to stop this is terrible, what would you encourage them to do? You posed a very valuable set of questions there and set of concerns, but how do you think we can cut through that?
I would say make sure your local social scientist is getting funded
Mhm.
to do
Mhm.
the work that needs to be done to make
Mhm.
data-driven decisions. In the interim, there are experts in child psychology and development, digital intimacies, that are at least equipped with a background in these spaces and consult on those types of works. My focus, for instance, is really on sense-making processes
Mhm.
and social perceptions, but there are a range of relevant policy, technology, social science experts who can convene and converge to make helpful decisions together.
And just in terms of your area, what are the attributes that tend to make people have those perceptions of that they're dealing with another mental agent?
We don't have a good handle on that
Okay.
yet. And that's part of the work that we are beginning right now, in part
Mhm.
because we don't have a consistent way to measure what
Mhm.
matters in
Mhm.
companionship as a construct. So we're building those measurements right now. And I hope to be able to come back to you in about a year and a
Mhm.
half with our data on that.
Mhm.
But my intuition would be the things that I had mentioned before,
Right.
where there might be a high fantasy or a high need for connection, where there might be already existing
Mhm.
isolating circumstances. But keep in mind that my perception is an innate human function. And we see faces and
Yeah.
personas and explicit or implicit forms of agency and all sorts of things, whether you're looking at the grill of a car and see a
Mhm.
smile, right? Or
Mhm.
the gnarly bits in a tree and see some eyes.
So we need to take that as a starting point, you're saying?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. It's a different kind of mind and intelligent agent there. Yeah, so that's good, right? So just one more thing on this point. Part of what you're describing is the challenge that we should be data driven and understand through research what the risks actually are, the benefits are, but that takes time and all this is moving very quickly, both the technology and the business. And part of the challenge is the business incentive for a for-profit firm that's making a companion is to maximize the engagement, maximize the amount of time, which might not be the most optimal set of incentives for concern with the welfare of the users. So is there anything that you think we can do to bridge that gap? Any steps that either to align those incentives or in terms of what kinds of guardrails or activities or steps might be useful?
I think I was talking with some folks with the EU's AI
Mm,
policy group, and their orientation tends to be around something like plausible risk,
mm,
to try to find out what is a slightly conservative
mm,
way of thinking about how can we make sure that we're preventing harm. And I think importantly, harm can come in a number of different ways, some of which are in opposition to financial incentives that you
mm,
mentioned. In as much as you might want to pay attention to, do I make sure that there is not language around self-harm in the
mm,
chat? You should also be paying attention to issues of privacy. And how does the data how does the chat that the human engages in, how is that being used? And is it being aggregated or perhaps quarantined in ways that would protect individual people's well-being and welfare? So the main idea here is it's easy to engage the moral panic, right, around
Yeah.
the exemplars from media headlines and lawsuits. But there are plenty of other things that should be paid attention to, right? Privacy doesn't get aggregated in a way that data could be connected to insurance databases or perhaps with emerging trends in governments in ways that could subject a user to additional harms or controls. But additionally, when we're thinking about the fact that these are friends that are controlled by corporations, we know that people can experience real intense grief when they're lost. So all it takes to harm a person is for a company to go under. One of the things that my participants in that last study were calling for was something akin to an AI user's Bill of Rights that would effectively allow them a certain amount of ownership or access to the personas that they've built, sometimes over years and across platforms, so that even if a company goes under, they can take certain parameters or settings or data sets and transfer it over to another platform. And that's not something that has to be a law to do, right? Organizations could reasonably create those infrastructures and allowances themselves.
Sure. It's again, we've had this debate about being able to port your social graph out of social media platforms and things like that. It's an interesting point you make that users are in many cases co-creating these personas. It's not just the LLM that provides it entirely. So what else do you think is missing from the general public conversation about these technologies?
I think we could stand to have a little bit better conversation around the relevant technological literacy and these notions of understanding. It is something that one of my colleagues and I are trying to wrap our heads around a little bit. This part of why I think for many people, companions are so appealing is that it gives people a sense of feeling understood, supported, and accompanied. And that idea of understanding, of co-experience, is inherently valuable to people. And how do these machines work? Is that understanding in the way that we might feel that it is? And in addition to how do they work? How are they being used and maintained? And how are people deriving profit from them? I think if there is a little bit of work, and I feel like that responsibility is in many ways on corporations that are companies that are actually developing and maintaining these, then that is a pathway toward reasonably responsible deployment so that folks, when they go into these, even if it's just out of curiosity, that they know what they're getting into, what the risks could be, and what their rights are and are not in the course of that conversation. I've entangled a couple of ideas there, but at the end of the day, there's a tendency to think about technology as doing stuff to us when we do have a certain amount of agency in the technologies that we choose and how we choose to use them.
Absolutely. That is actually a perfect place to end, even though what I think you've shown us is there's many open questions here that researchers like you are working on in this area. And so it's certainly going to be something that continues to develop over time, and really appreciate your perspectives in the conversation today. So Jamie, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening.
This is Kevin Werbach. If you want to go deeper on AI governance, trust, and responsibility with me and other distinguished faculty of the world's top business school, sign up for the next cohort of Wharton's Strategies for Accountable AI online executive education program, featuring live interaction with faculty, expert interviews, and custom-designed asynchronous content. Join fellow business leaders to learn valuable skills you can put to work in your organization. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there.